Welcome everyone to our podcast today. We're extremely happy to be joined by flautist J.A Jayanth, who you'll all know very well from Chennai. Hi Jayanth.
Hi Adesh, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. So Jayanth, we wanted to ask, it's obviously a very challenging time for everyone, particularly for artists and someone like you who performs throughout the year. How have you been managing through this period, and what have you been up to during the lockdown in India?
Okay, so firstly, so it's not very easy for musicians that are kind of used to performing very often. So it's not very easy on musicians and for musicians to really sit at home and come in terms with the fact that you're not sure of when the next stage performance is going to be. Even though we have had a bit of alternatives in the form of online concerts and stuff, they don't really give you the kind of excitement and the vibes and the pleasure of sharing stage with your co-artists and performing for a live audience. So I think that's a totally different experience altogether. It is something also very divine and natural, and you get to meet people. So it definitely is not tough. It definitely is tough for musicians to not get onto the stage. But I think it's the nature's way of asking, or rather setting, maybe give people the time and the space to actually rejuvenate and recoup and reinvent themselves to be nicer human beings at the very first place, so that the kind of exploitation that the human race has subjected the earth to in the past 200 250 years has been terrible. So I think this is the nature's way of instructing human beings to be nicer human beings, number one. And number two, personally, I have I think have had more time to do things that I have not been able to do in the past 10 years or so, which is like doing karate, practicing karate, and then reading some books, and then practicing more than what I have been in the past 3-4 years. So I get a good about 4 to 5 hours to practice and think of music all the time. And also it's a kind of experience in itself to learn and assimilate without having a certain agenda. So that makes learning really better and faster, because subconsciously you are so aware that okay, you just have to give your heart and soul to it without having an objective of having to do so. So that's just been beautiful and exhilarating.
And that's a really interesting point you make. Presumably, having performed so much in the last few years, since you've been playing professionally, a lot of your assimilation comes on stage. Because you're sort of on the go touring as well. Whereas now, I guess they're doing a lot of that off the stage now, and it's going back to sort of like you said, the pressure's off. You can sort of really go back into the learning in your own space as well.
Absolutely. And the last time I did this was after I finished my 10th grade. In India, I'm not sure how it happens there. So we get a break of about 3 to 4 months before we get into high school. So the first time I ever got into the habit of practicing for like 7-8 hours at a stretch, and also developing techniques and the very concept of self-learning. So I kind of got exposed to that idea after my 10th board exams, and it's happening only now after a gap of like 10 years. So it does feel good. And so basically I have been learning certain kritis that I have been wanting to for the past 4-5 years. And it's like a New Year resolution that you make. You just write it down in a diary, and you want to change yourself, fix things, but then it just goes up with the year. So yeah, so I have just been making use of the time and try to make it as productive as possible.
Fantastic.
You mentioned like this current situation has given you the time to do more self-learning and stuff. Other than like krittis, what else would you what does that encompass? Like what kind of other practicing things do you not usually get time for?
Oh, so if I were to think of certain techniques on the flute, or playing certain kinds of flute that I have been wanting to play and then master them. For instance, so this is a double bass flute that I started playing about 4 years back. So this is a flute that's about 104 centimeters long. So this is a double bass flute, so which basically traverses 3.5 octaves lower than the flute that I generally use in a concert. So it's a very, very difficult instrument to play, and I presume this is the longest flute to be played in Carnatic music. So I have just been spending more time trying to master this. I did play this in a couple of concerts last season. I also played this at the concert, at the Darbar Festival last October. So I mean, it is physically impossible and also musically impossible to present a composition as such in this. But it definitely does give you a very, very meditative spell. And in select ragas, like say Behag, for instance, or say Mohanam, for instance. So, just giving about 1 minute to 1.5 minutes of that very meditative spell on this flute, I think is the purpose of I trying to adapt this into Carnatic system. So yeah, I've been spending some time with this, and with certain practices that I have been wanting to do on the flute, just maybe play, say, a Sarali Varasai or an Alankaram in 3 speeds, 4 speeds, and then trying the 5th, and then trying to do that in Mekala Tisram, things like that. You basically tend to experiment because, an idle mind is a devil's, so I'm just trying to make use of the ideas that keep, coming, and trying to just implement them, execute them.
Do you feel that this is sort of more to do with the organizational side of things in India, and particularly India, actually? So during the December season, for example, do you feel that there are sufficient slots allocated for young instrumentalists coming through the scene? Because one thing I noticed in certain places is that there's a lot of youth Veena slots being promoted. This is just an observation of the last couple of years. I saw a lot of artists, but in general, the ratio of vocal concerts to instrumental concerts is very skewed. So what's your take on that?
Okay, it's very strange because I have a different opinion on this. As an orga, he or she is entitled to give opportunities based on the audience turnout. Now that's a prerequisite because at the end of the day, this is business also. So none of us are doing charity. So the organizers, they're not doing charity. The musicians, we are not doing charity. We're performing. So it's important that the performer is able to draw audience. Number one. Number two, I think it has always been the case wherein we have had more vocal musicians than instrumental musicians. It's always been the case, even though the kind of disparity that is projected or that probably may exist, is blown out of proportion today, maybe in the past 25 years or say 30 years. But I think it has always been the case wherein you have had 2 Vainikas opposed to 15 or 20 different vocalists, 1 or 2 flautists, as opposed to the reason being, Carnatic music is basically vocal, it's taught to you through vocal medium. It's not been composed for instruments. So it's basically something that came out, during the Bhakti movement, and people started singing it, and the compositions are in praise of Rama, Krishna, Devi. Uh, so I think the very concept of equal opportunity, meaning 50 slots for vocal music and 50 for instrumental music, will never work. I think this is a discussion that shall always remain a discussion, with due respects to people that do believe in this. But this is my take, and I think that can never work. That kind of a module can never work. What is important is, for an instrumentalist to be really, really good, if you trace back history, the instrumentalists that have been popular have been the ones that have been very, very good.
Yeah.
The acceptance definitely isn't as much it is for a vocalist, but that is because the instrument is such. பாட்டுல கொஞ்சம் ஸ்ருதி சேராம இருந்தா கூட அங்கங்க தெரியாது, because you always have lyrics or words to camouflage the fact. Whereas in instrumental music, we get onto the stage, with about 30% of a handicap of not having lyrics. So the moment you do not have a technical finesse, or the moment you're not, your pitching isn't okay, you're not technically sound, or there is something lacking in bhavam, or your playing does not have enough aritham, or adalla illana, so people tend to identify that again without really having enough. So that is where I said, this is a paradox. People can identify smaller aspects, saying, oh, this is not sounding good, and people have the right to do so because we are playing for them. So they are to choose whether they want to listen to this particular musician again or not. So I think that module of having 50-50 shall never work, but the organization definitely has a responsibility in ensuring that the ones that are doing good, and if the ones that are doing good are many in number, they be given enough opportunity. And if there is a cut in slots for whatever reason, I think they need to ensure that the good ones get an opportunity, so that good music prevails. As simple as that.
Yeah, I think really, really valid reflections and points there. One thing we haven't touched upon yet is your background, and you hail from a very large Guru Sishya parampara, and you started off learning from your grandparents. So tell us a little bit about how you got into music, and you're also a trained vocalist as well. So your experiences with both flute and vocals.
So yes, I do belong to a family of musicians. My great grandfather was an Asthana Vidwan at the erstwhile Palace of Mysore in the 20s and early 30s. He used to play the flute too. He was T.N. Sambasiva Iyer. And he was a contemporary of Palladam Sanjeeva Rao, Tripambaram, Swaminatha Pillai. These were some of the earlier popular flautists. Also, one of the important persons in our family is one Satanur Panchanatha Iyer that I have heard from people about. So he was my grandfather's forefather. I'm not sure how exactly, but he was instrumental in popularizing a lot of Muthuswami Dikshitar kritis. He was affectionately called Satanur Panju Iyer. So my grandfather learned to play the flute from his father, and T.R. Mahalingam later. So my grandfather is late T.S. Shankaran, one of the finest Carnatic flautists. And my grandmother was also a musician, Srimati V.S. Sundari, and she learned under Samangudi Srinivasa Iyer for some time, and then T.R. Balu, one of the prime disciples of the legend G.N. Balasubramanian. So so I belong to a family of musicians, and my first guru was my grandmother, V.S. Sundari. She was the one that kind of identified this talent in me when I was about 1.5 or 2. I used to respond to music And I used to, my mom keeps telling me that I would go to sleep and I would eat only after, my grandfather's TV recording was played on the television. And that also happens to be one of my earliest memory. The way in which he played, his mannerisms. I'm sure I couldn't make much of the music, understand the music, but his mannerisms, and then the flute that he used, something that I still possess, and that's been the most valuable gift that my grandfather kind of passed down to me. So I learned vocal music first from my grandmother, and the first thing that I sang was Krishnani Begane, my grandmom singing, and then I repeating it. So we also have it documented. And then later, I did learn vocal music like anyone else. I began with Sarali Varsai, Janta Varsai, then moved on to Alankarams, Geetams, Varnams, and then Kritis. Simultaneously, I also learned the basics of flute from my grandfather. So, just the sarigama padanis and things like that, just learning a couple of scales. But it wasn't an easy task for me to kind of impress my grandfather for him to really teach me, because he never wanted me to be a part of, or rather take music up as a full time. So he was absolutely against the idea of I learning the flute or getting into music. So he just wanted, even as a child, he always wanted me to be a doctor. So I kind of had to impress him in order to really pursue him to teach me seriously. And then my grandmother was the one that really insisted and ensured my grandfather teaches me to play the flute. So we slowly began kind of having a training when I was 5. And the growth, the progress was rapid. And then I learned about, because I never learned the basics on the flute, by the way. So my grandfather never set my fingers up on the flute. In fact, my fingering positioning of the fingers on the flute and my grandfather's is totally different, and so are the blowing techniques. So he never taught me, the exact way to do it, like just hold the flute like this and play. So that was never how it was. We started off with Ninnukuri in Mohanam, and subsequently Vatapi Ganapatam. These are some of the classes that I do remember. And then I really had to impress him. It was 98 when, so we used to live in Kolkata back then. So, with the help of the TV recording, I learned my grandfather's TV recording. I learned Inta Saukyamani and Kalala Nirchina and Deepakam and Ninnuvina Namadendu all by myself. So the day he came, I played this for him. And that's when he kind of, probably believed that, okay, this guy has something and we should teach him. So that's when he started teaching me, like seriously. And what he taught me first was a Ragam Tanam Pallavi in Ragam Bhairavi.
Lovely.
Wow.
So that's how my training began. And the best part about, being my grandfather's student was the fact that he never really kind of imparted his way of playing on me. Or maybe I was a rebel. So every time he would tell me to do something, I was like, no, I'll do it this way. So he kind of let me play the flute the way I wanted it to. So there was a lot of foundation given to me that made me really strong, in the sense, how does one learn on his own? How does one develop from what's being given? That's very important, so that a musician doesn't remain stale. And the same happened when I also joined under Sangeeta Kalanidhi Sanjay Subramanian sir. So the way in which both my grandfather and Sanjay sir kind of imparted music in me was very, very similar. Just the classes with Sanjay sir was a lot more disciplined than what it was with my grandfather.
So all throughout your musical journey, you've been the recipient of many awards and many accolades. And one of them was being Carnatic Idol of the Year in 2007. Tell us your experiences of that, and what are your views on competitions Is that a good thing for, young aspiring artists?
Yeah, so I was 14 when the Carnatic Idol thing came up, and that was the first time Carnatic Idol was introduced in Chennai, and it happened at the Nardagana Sabha main hall. Remember that vividly. And that was also the first and last competition that I took part in.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, I did my schooling in Kendra Vidyalaya, which never really kind of had the inter-school competition kind of a scene that other schools in Chennai did. For instance, the PS Senior Secondary School or the PSBB. So I was never exposed to the concept of competing as such. And personally, I don't believe in competitions. But this sounded really, really big, Carnatic Idol. So my parents did want me to be a part of it. And I remember the preliminary auditions were in Ragasudha Hall, and the judges were Prapancham Sitaraman on the flute and TRS sir. They were the two judges. When my turn came, I think we had to choose a certain number, and then whatever the number was, so I chose the number 8, which is my date of birth, and then the associated raga was Begada. So I had to present an alapana in ragam Begada for about 3.5 minutes, if I remember it right. And then I did. Then the second round was where I had to do swarams, and again I had to choose a number, and then it was Pantuvarali, and then one of the judges asked me if I knew a composition, a Rettakala composition in Raga Mohanam. I said, no, I know Rama Ninnu Namina, which is Adi Talam Urukalai. So I played that particular kriti, I did Neraval, and then I did the Swarams, and that's it. So after that was over, something that I recall was I got into the main hall from the other entrance after my thing was over, and T.N. Krishnan sir was very appreciative of my sound and tone. He said that Begada was sounded like Mahalingam, and no wonder your T.S. Shankaran's grandson, and the Nebeli Santanagopalan sir was also very appreciative. So these are certain memories that I have out of that particular competition, and I did win it for instrumental section.
In terms of your development with the flute, so you started off under your grandparents as well, and you mentioned obviously you hail from T.R. Mahalingam sir's style and school as well. How much of that influence has come down to you? Do you listen to a lot of his recordings? How much can you take when it's not possible to see the fingering techniques and the way that the person plays the instrument? I guess, what are your experiences with that?
Oh, of course. The first recording of Mali sir that I listened to was Viriboni, and this was way back. I was 4 or 5 years old. My grandfather had just come back from the US, and one of his students had given him a collection of Mali cassettes. And the sound of his flute. So it's a misconstrued notion that just because it was higher in pitch, it was sweet. That's a misconstrued notion, because something that Mali's flute or Mali sir's flute, when I say Mali, I have as much respect for him as when I say Mali sir. So I think flute Mali, his tone and the weight and the perfect pitching is what defines his flute playing first. Even though he played at a pitch as high as G and also G sharp in his earlier years, the kind of flute that he used was so thick, with such a thick reed. When I say thickness, it's very important that as an instrumentalist, you sound like whichever genre you belong to. Every genre has a kind of frequency, has a sound, has a way in which the music sounds. So when I speak of the thickness, it's this thickness of the reed, and also the diameter of the flute. So the kind of flutes that Mali sir used were, just phenomenal. You needed to have such phenomenal lung capacity to be able to play what he did, back in the day. And also one of the reasons his music was so appealing was, it had everything. Be it Mandarastai, the bass, be it the the Vilamba Kalam, the Chauka Kalam, in which he established the kritis and the speed at which he played. So I think it had everything. It was lightning speed when he would do something of, a Dharini Telsu Kontini, playing that on the third speed is, especially on the flute, the kind of flute. Again, it's not to do with the pitching, but it's the kind of flute, the thick flute, so much for you to blow, yet you are so pitch perfect. So things like these, the sounding, the tone, the pitching is what first absorbed my attention towards his flute playing, and also at a time wherein you didn't really have microphones, you didn't really have gadgets that can enhance your sounds. Just imagine the kind of hard work those musicians really put in, and how honest they were with their music and with the sounding, because one sound is their identity. So I think we got to be very honest with that. So I started listening to Mali ever since, and I must not lie. And I think it's an open truth that I used to just copy him, just try to play whatever he played, just like that, and try getting, very close to him, the way he sounded. So he probably has the biggest influence on me after G.N. Balasubramaniam sir and Hariprasad Chaurasia ji from the north. I learned Viriboni from his recording, Mali sir's recording, Sarasi Janaba, Kamboji Varanam from his recording, Dharini Tilsu Kontini, and also the Tisra Kanaka that he does. So that's a Tisra, the Korapa that he plays. So I have listened to, I'm very proud of the fact that I've listened to possibly 95% of Mali's music that's available on Netflix.
Wow. One last thing I wanted to ask you before we move on to the rapid fire was, you mentioned that you've been doing karate. Is that something that you've been doing for a while, or have you just taken it up recently?
No. So I did learn karate for about 7 years back when I was doing my school. And then I had stopped it after my 12th because I got busy with concerts and stuff. And I did pursue my engineering, by the way. So that is something that I don't include in my bio data, but I did do my engineering. My grandfather wanted me to, and that's the only reason I did it. So there was a lot of time that both music and engineering consumed, so I had left practicing karate. It's been a long time, so I've just gotten back to doing it in the past 1.5 months or so. Very tough.
What belt are you on?
I went up to brown. That was the one right before black.
Before black, right? Yeah. So now we'll move on to the rapid fire section.
So, first question is, how many books have you read so far this year?
Oh, this year? It's just been 2. So, and both of them being, so one of them is a biography on Sidney Poitier, which is The Measure of a Man. And the other one that I'm reading now is an autobiography of sitar legend Pandit Ravi Shankar, titled Ragamala. So It's just been 2.
What song are you currently learning, or did you most recently learn?
So I just finished learning Raghuvar and Annu in Atwarali.
What is your favorite TV channel?
Oh, well, we have not had television in our home since 2007.
Wow.
So I haven't watched television for almost 13 years. But I do remember there was a sports channel called 10 Sports, and that used to air cricket matches that took place in Sharjah. And that was the first time I watched this particular match with India versus Australia, wherein Sachin scores 143.
Yeah.
143 in 131 balls, if I remember it right. So India lost the match, but then they qualified for the finals. And I also remember watching this particular one where Tendulkar scored a century against Zimbabwe, and both Tendulkar and Ganguly, they chased a target of about 198. And they won it. So I used to love watching 10 Sports. I was a big cricket fan.
What has been one of your lifelong dreams?
Oh, to be lifelong dreams. Well, to be known as, one of the finest flute players, maybe, and also at the same time be a good human being, and also to have a school to impart flute education. So basically, teaching flute and to spread this art among rather worldwide. So that's a goal.
One Hindustani musician, past or present, you'd love to jam with?
Okay, so I wouldn't say I would want to jam with him, but maybe just sit beside him and respectfully possibly follow whatever he's playing, no matter whether it's on the stage or off the stage. I think it's Pandit Hariprasad Charaseji. Just want to sit next to him, possibly with him on the chair and I sitting down, and just very respectfully getting this very honor and privilege to hold my flute with him playing it, and just maybe just following bits of what he's playing. I think that would be a great honor.
If you could paint one thing, what would you paint?
Paint? Maybe a portrait of my grandfather.
Oh,
nice.
What is your least favorite beverage?
I'm not a big fan of soft drinks. So it's been 15, 16 years since I consumed any of that. The Thums of Pepsi, Coke, Sprite, none of that.
Yeah. Nice.
One fashion trend you just do not get?
I think one fashion trend that I do not get.
Or one fashion trend that you like.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, the one that I do not get is when I was doing my college, there was this fad around low hip jean. That's number one. A fashion trend that I do like is, I like to wear kurta with a pajama and not a veshti. Not sure if that's a fashion trend of sorts. It's just that I do that. I'm not very comfortable with the veshti on. But I really like how people, musicians dress up, wearing just plain white, something very simple. I think there's a lot of class in simplicity. So yeah, that's anything that's not gaudy is something that I really like.
A Carnatic, your favorite Carnatic composer, or a composer that you love, you can keep playing their compositions.
I think it has to be Sri Rajarajeshwari.
Nice. What is one of your favorite memories from your childhood?
From my childhood is that of, as a child, I always used to play around with the flutes. I remember, my mom keeps telling me wherever we went, we stepped out, I would just have two flutes in both my hands. And I also had this ability to distinguish good flutes from the bad ones. So every time I asked for my grandfather's flute, he would give me the ones that he probably bought for like 10 rupees, the ones that were not, professional ones. And I would break them because they didn't produce the kind of sound that his flute did. So I vividly remember those incidents. I probably was 3 or 3.5 or 4. But that's one, and also days when I used to learn from my grandfather directly. So I really miss, and those are some of the most wonderful childhood memories that I have.
If you could teleport anywhere, anytime right now, where would it be?
If I could?
If you could teleport anywhere, if you could go anywhere, anytime right now.
Oh, with the kind of heat and that you have here in Chennai right now, I probably would want to go to, say, Scotland or Iceland maybe.
And that pretty much rounds off our rapid fire section. So you didn't say pass for anything. So I think that's a great turnout.
Well, I'm glad. So there are certain techniques. So how do you basically improve on your technique on the flute? So there are some techniques that are pertaining to the flute alone. The blowing technique or the fingering technique, the double fingering, the cross fingering, doing the janta versailles and 4 speeds, things like that. And also, I think there is a certain amount of technique that one needs to impart in the kriti that he's playing, or the raga alapana, or the tanam. So, learning from Sanjay sir in the past 6-7 years, he would sing and I would play it on the flute. So it was such a challenge to sound close to his singing. So that's when I realized it's just not to do with Tutukaram or the Veraladi or Akaram, or just giving a Tutukaram wherever you find the lyrics. For instance, if I were to take a very simple kriti like Mahaganapatim, for instance. So if I have to do Mahaganapatim Manasa Smarami, it's not just that. It's little more to it. And it's not to do with the bhavam again, it's to do with the technique. Bhavam is an intrinsic part of Carnatic music. So having good technique doesn't really mean that it lacks bhavam. So if I were to play it like how it's sung in terms of giving importance to the lyrics. So if it is Mahaganapatim Manasa Smarami, so there is Mahaganapatim. So you actually close your lip. So how would you do that on the flute? So just before you go on to the sa, which says manasa, you just close it. It just brings about that effect. So to work with such detailing for every kriti has definitely been a challenge. And so this lockdown has just given me the opportunity to work around this furthermore.
Earlier, you mentioned that when you were learning from your grandfather and stuff, he didn't sort of tell you to play in a specific technique and stuff with a specific fingering. I myself am a Western flautist actually, and when I was taught, my teacher didn't really focus on the fingering that much. Maybe it's just that I wasn't advanced enough to go into it in depth, but she obviously the things that she focused on was like, don't lift your fingers too far away from the keys and stuff to allow you to kind of play fast.
Exactly.
Yeah, but other than that, there wasn't so much sort of technique that she like drilled into me. So in terms of like your fingering technique and how it differs and stuff, how is that different for Carnatic music?
So it's a very important point that you just said, which is not to lift your fingers farther away from the flute. So I don't think many of the Carnatic flautists do follow that, because it so happens that the fingers go up, so that also kind of affects the speed at which you play. So one such thing that I did practice is not to lift your fingers farther away from the flute holes. So, and also have a way in which the fingers come back right in time and close the hole just to the extent that it needs to, so that you produce the sound without, or rather you produce the note without loss in the sound. So when I say without loss in the sound, so depending upon the size of the flute and the diameter of the flute, you kind of know that, okay, this is the maximum sound that it can produce. In the sense, when I do, so there's a maximum that it can withstand in terms of what it can withstand in terms of the blow, the air that you're given. Yeah. So if I were to do, it sounds a bit anemic. So regardless of how thick the flute is or how thin it is, I think it is for the instrumentalist to understand his instrument. So you need to be, it's like attaining an equilibrium with your instrument, that you know what it can produce, and try your best to work, to make it work to the best of your abilities to produce the best melodies. So when you do the lower octaves, for instance, so this is the maximum it can produce. So, the lower octave is to produce the kind of the bass effect. So if you were to do, that's fine, but that's just a range. So we need to understand the range that your flute can actually produce and work around it. So so you basically work around the tonality of the instrument in such a way that you bring the best of the flute also.
Okay, so it's really about knowing your flute and the sort of the best way to bring out the best frequencies and to get it the most like resonant for your.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to get back to your question a little more detail. So the kind of the fingering technique. So the Carnatic music, the Carnatic flautists, they have wide range of ways in which they hold flute. Some of them are like this, then some of them are like this, and then some like this, and then some like this. So there are various ways in which people have it's like batting stands while playing cricket. So they have, each one has their own. So my grandfather used to have a grip which was similar to this, like his guru, flute Mali sir. I started off also like this, but then I think I don't remember when exactly, I just shifted my grip, slightly pushing the middle finger, inwards, or rather outwards, if I were to put it this way. So it just gave me more grip and comfort to be able to play the half re on the flute, which is a very difficult note. So when I do a ragam like Todi, for instance, so it just gave me more grip on my left hand, which also happens to be an important uh, uh, part of your finger holding, the flute holding. So I just kind of changed this, and that also helped me play the bass flutes with ease because the holes were apart. And I could also end up playing a kriti, for instance. So it could also help me in playing the longer flutes. So I just changed that, and also the way in which I play certain notes, certain connectivities, and also working on the Mandarasthai and the Adhistarasthai Shadjan. So I'm not sure if it's picking the higher frequencies, but
yeah, definitely.
Also, I can do the top sa, also the top ni, the top da, so, and also linger on them for a very long time. So certain things that I kind of just practice and worked around to be able to play on the flute.
Nice, very cool.
Fantastic. And so obviously you've talked about developing depth in the mantrasthai as well. So what if you don't mind sharing with us, what techniques have you used to help develop that kura range?
So I think you just need to have firstly you just need to have good ears to sound, and number two, have a good blowing technique and understanding, as I said, understanding what your instrument is capable of producing. So even though I say having a good blowing technique, that's very cliche. How do I it's like perceiving the abstract. So it's very difficult to kind of explain what I do, but probably you can pick something from the positioning maybe. So I just try to blow it in a certain angle that it produces. That's okay, but so basically I blow it in such a in such an angle that it produces more sound. So I can actually feel the air pass through the the flute. I can actually feel that on my fingers.
Yeah.
And then if you were to do and then also having this kind of a blowing technique helps you basically overcome the dependence on the microphone. So it's not okay to always rely on a microphone and the kind of microphone that you use. I think it's also to do with the manner in which you practice and whether your technique is right. Because if your technique is good, I think even if the microphone is okay, even if the auditorium isn't, there are certain auditoriums wherein your flute tends to sound squeaky, and there are certain auditoriums wherein the sound is really, really good and it's acoustically built. And there are certain auditoriums wherein you don't need a microphone. And there are some wherein having a microphone is not helping you either. So the idea, if as a musician we're supposed to perform everywhere we are invited, wherever we are invited, I think we need to have a good technique so that we sound good no matter what. So it helps you overcome that deficiency, number one. And then the number two is you can basically go on to the lower note as well, beyond what the flute lets you produce. For instance, that's a ga. That's a Sutta Gandharam, and then that's a re. So it basically is that when you understand the range of your ability to blow and what the instrument can produce, you basically tend to produce more notes, and you overcome the deficiency that the flute has in terms of reaching octaves. So just things like that.
Like you said, you use a wide variety of flutes from all sorts of sizes, and I'm guessing you need certain different types of breathing techniques for each of those flutes. So what are your do you do any sort of breathing exercises?
Yeah, so I think that's very, very important. It's a very good question because just like how you have 10 different vocalists sounding differently from each other in terms of the voice, in terms of the sound, in terms of the voice culture, your breathing technique also differentiates you from other flautists. So when I say this, I basically include flautists from different genres also, be it Hindustani, be it a folk musician that plays the flute, or say someone who plays the Western classical, or the penny whistle, or the recorder, the shakuhachi, the Japanese flute. So it's very important that a flautist works on his breathing technique. I've always heard my elders say that sound, the tone, the tonality in one's instrument, or be it melody instrument or percussion, is a God's gift. The sound is something that you get naturally. But something that you also get naturally is to be worked on, so that it seems fresh every time you play, and that there's some amount of mastery over it. So I just do things like pranayamam every day, and then I just have this exercise of taking deep breath in and then trying to hold it for like certain period of time, and then doing the exhale, things like that.
Nice. I know you set a challenge, or there was one available recently with the set of the different ragams that you played. And you asked people to name those the ragams actually, which I thought was brilliant. So talk us through how you have developed the skill to sort of just transgress through the different ragams and so many different ragams without getting muddled.
So it's actually very interesting. So firstly, the video that I did post on Facebook, I think it was one of the concerts from our US tour last spring, and that was in Ottawa. So we did a rag, 28 different ragams. I just posted about 13 or 14 maybe. But then the Ragamalika section alone went for like 6.5 minutes. We did about 28, 29 ragas, and that was absolutely unplanned. And I had no ideas of doing it, just that it just came, and I was like, okay, let's just take it forward. But as a practice, what I do is we have alankarams. So I have this habit of playing each of the alankaram in different ragas. So that's something I never started that as a practice to say. I just enjoyed doing it. I just like the fact that, okay, let's just try. I it's always nice to throw challenges on oneself, rather yourself. Just try to see. So I was like, okay, if you can do one raga after the other in each of the lines of the alankarams, maybe in the third speed or the fourth speed, just try. So that's a kind of it became a kind of exercise that I started doing, and I think that helps.
Definitely. And would there be any chance you could demonstrate for the viewers with maybe 3 ragams now, like, or maybe 3 or 4 ragams?
Sure. So Harikambodi, Ganamurti, and Sri Kalyani.
Yeah.
So just like that. So it can be in any order. So basically challenge yourself. And the point is, when you start doing this, so as a flautist, you have different, and then you have, so there's a challenge in doing the half re after you do the full re. So it's just experiment and practicing and trying out different things.
No, great tip, and I think that's useful for everyone, all instruments, vocalists alike as well. So I think it's a great.
Absolutely.
I think the listeners would love, maybe if you could play for a couple of minutes, if there's anything like a piece that you had on your mind that you wanted to play. Absolutely divine, Janaranjani. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm sure the Rasikas are delighted to hear that. Anna, before we sort of look to conclude this podcast, we've been asking the musicians who've been taking part to just, if they want to say a few words about the current situation, and any sort of points that they wanted to get across to Rasikas, fans, other musicians as well. So is there anything you wanted to say on the current coronavirus situation or a message you had for people?
Oh, firstly, a lot of prayers for the situation to get better, and for this, for people to basically find a kind of solace in what's happening around the world. So a lot of prayers that things fall in place and that life gets back to normalcy. That's number one. Number two, for Rasikas out there, there's a lot of music that's coming your way in the form of Facebook Live and the podcasts, and also hats off to youngsters like you, Adesh, Janakan and Savita, who have come up with this London Carnatic Foundation. So I think we need more youngsters like you to take Carnatic music to the next level, basically, and develop a lot more rasikas. One request would be, to the rasikas, that they shouldn't really stop coming for live concerts once the situation gets better. I think there's no substitute as such to live concerts. Rasika shouldn't get used to sitting at home and enjoying music. I think regardless of the status that a musician enjoys, I think every musician would really want more people to turn up for their live concerts and make that a hit, make that a success. So I really wish, pray, and hope that Rasikas do turn up in large numbers across the world to live concerts, live events, live shows, and yeah. So that's one request that I would have for all the Rasikas out there.
Fantastic, very, very poignant message to leave with the Rasikas for this podcast. Jayanth, you've been absolutely amazing today. I mean, we've had at least from our side, it's been fantastic.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. It's really, really lovely. Yeah.
My pleasure. Thank you so much once again for having me and inviting me to be a part of this very interesting podcast.